Hello and welcome to Sustain, a production of Na Arafetu, Center for Climate, Biodiversity and Society. I'm Maria Armoudian, and in this episode, we examine future cities in the era of climate change and other environmental challenges. With over half the global population living in urban centers, a number projected to rise to around 2/3 by 2050, the relationship between cities and the climate crisis is increasingly important. How can we adjust the nature of urban spaces to both adapt to and mitigate the changing climate? Does this require the complete reimagining of the modern city, or just more subtle tweaks to the existing design? Joining us today is the co-founder and director of the Future Cities Research Hub at the University of Auckland, Dr. Paola Boarin, Associate Professor of Architecture, Technology, and Sustainability. Also with us are the affiliated researchers, Dr. Iresh Jayawardena, lecturer in planning, Dr. Tim Welch, senior lecturer in planning, Dr. Alessandro, senior lecturer in architecture technology, and Dr. Manfredini, associate professor of architecture. So welcome to Sustain. It's great to have you all here to talk about future cities and what we need to be doing really to address what we're up against with climate change and the other environmental concerns. So I thought it would be a good place to start with the challenges, right? What are the challenges? What are the challenges for the current cities when we look toward the future? Paola, let's start with you.
Thank you, Maria, and thanks for having us today. There's many challenges, really, we are facing from an environmental point of view, from a social point of view, from a well-being point of view, from an economic point of view, and all of these are interconnected, strongly interconnected. And it's from this assumption that we started working together transdisciplinarily. What it means to us is that we need to face all the effect of climate change, for instance, in many ways and from many perspectives. So we can't work alone. For instance, I am an architect, so I'm a professional coming from the built environment sector. And I can't work by myself to solve this challenge, for instance, of climate change. Our cities at the moment, we've seen it from let's say around last year, from Cyclone Gabrielle. We are facing a lot of pressures from an urban development point of view. And when it comes to climatic event and really major climatic event, our urban infrastructure, our built environment is very fragile. And the fragility that we've seen is not only around the materials, the buildings, or the infrastructure, but the impacts extend way beyond that into our social systems, into our ecological systems, and in our economy.
To help us understand what...
Yeah, for sure. Take the example of Cyclone Gabrielle, what happened last year, because we built a lot of impervious surfaces like roads and concrete slabs, and our roofs are not really retaining that permeability that the soil used to have before the building was built. Of course, every time we do have a huge amount of rain that falls on a specific spot, these rains needs to go somewhere. And because of the lack of permeability in the soil, the rain doesn't go really in the proper way. And in this specific example, it started damaging the buildings, it started damaging the infrastructure, overloading the infrastructure, and ultimately impacting on the environment.
And drowning people as well.
And drowning people, exactly, because again, the impact of that event went beyond the built environment or the natural ecosystem, but went into affecting people. And went into affecting economies as well, because if we consider, for instance, the industrial areas that we see in our cities, inside our cities, included in our cities, what we call the urban industrial areas, many areas had to stop working because they were completely flooded. They couldn't continue their business activity because of that. So there were a lot of impacts on the economy as well related to climate change. So we need to start thinking our built environments and the many relationships between the built environment and the natural environment in a completely radical different way. And we need to start thinking about the complexities of the interactions, how the way we build, the materials we use in our buildings, the way we design and build our infrastructures can have an impact on long-term climate change effect. And on the other side, how do they become more resilient to climate change?
So I'm going to return to that to try to understand the shifts in just a minute. But first, let's just see what other challenges we're seeing. Tim Welch, why don't we start over there with you so that I can
Sure.
come around the circle?
Sure. Let's start with the money. And it's always the challenge when we talk about cities and development. We've somehow in the last 100 years managed to both overbuild and underinvest our infrastructure. So by most accounts in this country, we're about $210 billion in deficit in infrastructure spending. This is primarily because we've overbuilt a lot of our engineered infrastructure. So our roads, our pipes, our wastewater management systems, all of these have been built to such a degree that we've saddled future generations with massive amounts of debt to maintain this infrastructure. But at the same time, we haven't invested in the sustainable types of infrastructure that would make us more resilient to future effects of climate change. And so that puts us in a really big hole, and we haven't put the money forward that would keep us going and move us in that right direction. At the same time, we have things like a public transportation system that leaves a lot of people out of the system. So people who can't access affordable public transport, they're forced into driving on a daily basis. That creates a huge financial burden for many families around the country. We have infrastructure, again, like pipe infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, that doesn't adequately capture rainwater. When we see heavy rains, we see flooding as a result. We see it combining with sewer and contaminating our bays, on our water systems. And so we've over-relied on these pipes that were built 70 years ago and haven't been adequately maintained. So it has a losing capacity. And finally, we have a social infrastructure that we've underinvested in as well. And a lot of people, when they think about infrastructure, they think about what we've built out of concrete and steel. But the reality is that there's an underlying social infrastructure that moves the city and keeps people connected to their neighborhoods, allows people to be part of their community. And we've underinvested significantly in those areas too.
Do you think that underinvestment keeps certain people separated? Is that what you're saying? Like connecting, but some, but not connecting others?
What it does is it reduces the economic mobility of certain groups of people. They have a hard time moving up in society and gaining wealth and building the financial capacity that would help them find better careers, get better education, and help future generations move forward as well.
Iresh, what would you add?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's really great points. I think I would like to add is climate change related natural hazards or geology related natural hazards. These are all common phenomena nowadays. I think as a country or maybe as a nation or maybe globally, we are very much prepared to react to these events when they happen. This point is really connecting back to what Tim said, where the actually preparation is, where we are forecasting this situation, may or may not happen at some stage, because we are living in a world full of uncertainty. But we need to actually communicate to people that this is how it's going to be look like, in the world. So when we are looking at a world full of uncertainty, and if you want to be not just immediately responsive to disasters or any climate change hazards, we need to create a place where people are aware of these things could happen anytime. So we have the budget in place, we have the infrastructure in place, so we are actually more
like
adaptable.
Preparedness,
yeah. So where we are start to think about preparedness for these sort of events that could happen anytime, especially given where the New Zealand is a geographical location. So my point is, I think mainly we are very oversight in terms of preparing our communities, our infrastructure, our cities, and to be able to adapt to or even responding to these sort of events, climate change, natural hazards events. We are waiting for something to happen like Cyclone Gabriel, and then we panic. Naturally, communities are resilient. They find each other. Our social networks, people find their own neighbors, helping each other. So, for example, National Emergency Management Authority have done a really good job, during the Cyclone Gabriel. But mostly, actually, community were really good at helping each other. But if we had pre-preparedness, so those events, I think we will be avoiding so much impacts in our city planning.
Alessandro.
Well, what I could add, picking up what Paola said before, I think another important area is related to energy, and in particular to energy efficiency. That has been said many times, but we know that New Zealand has 85% of electricity that is considered clean, so considered clean energy, but there is also a great interest in investing in renewables, for instance, which is also considered very, very important. Before doing that, I personally think that it's much more important to look at the energy efficiency of buildings and infrastructure that we have. So we have a priority that is to ensure that all homes and also other type of buildings are, first of all, energy efficient. And then we can invest also in clean energy.
Boy, that's going to be quite an ordeal given the buildings here.
Yeah, in fact, Paola mentioned something that is very important: improving materials and technologies that we use, and in particular, the way we produce materials and the way we use them into the design. So it also involves a shift in the way we design buildings as well, if we want to use new materials and apply materials that are more efficient also for the construction of the buildings that we have.
Manfredo. Oh, now it's very hard to add anything on to this discussion that is probably meaningful. I might pick up on the discussion of social infrastructure, which is quite a critical point that we need to look at in terms of space, and we are architects and planners. But also there might be aspects that the spatial infrastructure has to do with the way in which cultural infrastructures and other aspects of, say, individualization, trans-individualization are related to it. We have an area that is possibly quite out of date in terms of its conception, which is in terms of space, urban space, is the question of public space and urban commons. Why is it out of date? It is out of date because we have very important trends that we tend to overlook entirely. We're still designing, and Tim was talking about the question of transport, we're still designing the city with logics of 5 minutes movement, 10 minutes movement, 15 minutes movement. We hardly take into consideration what is happening with the new technologies. We have a dimension of mediatization that is incredibly developing and creating new geographies and new forms of topologies, if you want to consider that in a sort of through a sort of metaphorical reasoning. The way in which we create networks, the way in which our practices are moving, translocalizing from places to place, and keeping in one way or another alive particular cultural, social, but also environmental dimensions that probably come from whatever it is, the experience of millennia of being resilient and sustainable, is something that is moving completely beyond the way in which our way and our instruments are operating. When we look at public space, which was a fantastic person, Hannah Arendt, who was talking about public space as the space of appearance. Appearance of what? Appearance of the truth, she would say. Well, the question is exactly that one. This is a dimension of, trans-individuation or transculturalism that is so important in places like New Zealand. We are probably, at the same time, one of the most remotest places on Earth, but one of the most complex in terms of exactly cultural dimension. So we need a way in which this transition, a transition that rely on what has been dubbed as cosmopolitics. So the reciprocal understanding, it doesn't mean to go towards elements of just understanding or hybridizing culture, but on the opposite, understanding what are differences and how these differences are actually enriching our daily experience and our daily being together.
And how does that comport with these future city ideas? How do these pieces all fit together? Paola, maybe you.
Yeah, well, the opportunity for us to get together was offered by the National Science Challenge 11, Building Better Cities, Towns and Buildings, because of the multiple scales that were involved. So we were working around all these different dimensions: the building dimension, the infrastructural dimension, social and physical, and the relationship between the built environment and the natural environment. So that really gave us the opportunity to start putting all our mind around some common areas of inquiry, some common questions around, for instance, climate change or urban well-being. How do we build systems and cities that are going back and become closer again to nature and incorporate nature much more, but also how do we become more inclusive and how do we guarantee, let's say, we economically thrive while also protecting our systems and enabling the social dimension as well. We do work across all these scales with all our research projects. We do work not only, let's say, within the people in future cities, but we are strongly projected outwards, across the university. We have a lot of partnerships. Narafetu is one. For instance, the Co-Create Age Center in the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, because we really want to understand things from multiple dimensions. To do that and to facilitate that, we have structured the center into 4 main domains. But again, they are just nominal in a way. It's just to say what we would like to drive the conversation onto. So we do have the sustainable, resilient, and regenerative approaches, which is led by Iresh. The urban innovations approach that is led by Tim. The low carbon solutions and zero carbon and zero emission economy that is led by Alessandro, and the urban well-being, the spatial justice, the community development that is led by Manfredo. And all of us work around the development of research projects on
So
this
if you were
front.
going to think a mass transformation of a city or a part of a city that would incorporate all of these pieces in it, are there any examples in the world?
Hard to say.
I have heard, not really being in your field, that Singapore is really advancing a lot of these things, a lot of these ideas, incorporating nature, incorporating people, communities, that sort of a thing. I don't know, are there other examples?
Yeah, I would say there's examples of aspects that we all mentioned today. I'm not sure in this moment there's a really best practice summarizing all these good practices that we elaborated on today. But for sure, there's many countries trying to move into the direction of becoming more resilient, and also countries trying to become more regenerative. Like, for instance, the case of Copenhagen in Denmark, and many other buildings as well in the world. But these buildings are trying to move beyond the concepts of sustainability, which is a concept we've been using so far extensively, but that really doesn't provide that dimension of giving back to the environment more than what we took from the environment. So the concept of sustainability is a concept of a balance. We take as much as we give back. The concept of regenerative is that we give back much more than what we take. So we go and work on restoring those damages that we've produced so far. And
is
for
that
instance,
possible?
Yes, that's possible at building level, at neighborhood level, at city level. The example of Denmark is an interesting one. They used waste management a plant that was also a landmark really in the city, the big tower and so forth. And they integrated on the roof of that huge, massive power plant, let's say a surface that could be integrating all the natural and native species. So it's a green roof, but at the same time, it's used as an economic driver. It has become a ski slope. People are skiing on that roof. So it really...
So what happens if they go off the roof? Do they
No,
fall
they
into...
won't. They won't. But the positive driver of that building is that it produces more energy than what it consumes. There's much more, let's say, ecological diversity and biodiversity on that roof that there is around the building. So it's kind of become a really positive hub. We can all take examples
I think that one is one that also has a hiking trail where you can oversee the city and all of that.
Absolutely. It's a lot of integrated dimensions, rainwater management.
Community.
It's the community dimension, it's the ecological dimension, it's the energy efficiency dimension, it's the energy production dimension. So many of the aspects that we mentioned today.
Yes, one of the things that has been
Alessandro.
mentioned is energy production. Exactly. If you produce more than you need, you can give it back to the community. So that's one of the challenges that is worth investigating also in our context. How can we enable this?
I know there are places that are involved in that. In California, people are able to sell their extra green energy back to the utility so that they are not just negative.
Absolutely. This happens also in Europe, of course, because there are incentives to do that. But the next step is probably understanding how we can help other communities that are perhaps low-income communities through energy generated in other contexts. So it's obviously something that is worth investigating. I'm not saying that it's simple because it's required a series of agreements, but it's worth being investigated.
Do you think that in terms of the energy generation, that one of the problems is the the need for those companies to keep making a profit?
Of course.
One of the good parts about in California, for example, is because the utilities were publicly owned. I mean, they were owned by, like the city of LA had its own.
Exactly.
And so it made sense to reduce that and not worry about making a profit. Does anybody in the project think about the overall economic structure of some of these aspects? No, that's kind of the political aspect, really, political economy.
Yeah.
Oh, I think, that's the word I was about to say. The political economy is really, really important because, the science and the data and information is all out there. And it's about how do we convey and translate this information to the decision makers, the politicians. So it really comes with economy and money and finance and budget. So I think political economy drives quite a lot of initiatives that we want to come with in terms of policy interventions or in terms of technological advancements. So all these factors will be driven by the political decision-making processes. So I think one of the reasons for us all together to do in terms of future cities research is to find a way to translate these expertise from various fields that are associated with architecture, planning, built environment, ecology, and environment with a very evidence-based, research-informed approach to convince these decision makers. But I think still everyone, science and research field grapples with that. But I think it is something we all have to deal with.
Anything you would add, Tim Welch?
Yeah, so I said earlier that it was all about the dollars, but the reality is that it comes down to political will as well. So, I mean, if you look at something like Singapore, essentially the political system is a benevolent dictator. Right? I mean, they can do what they want to do. We don't have that structure in New Zealand, and most of the world doesn't have that structure. So it all comes down to the political will to get things done.
Are you making a sort of a positive note for a benevolent dictatorship?
There are positives about the infrastructure that Singapore has, but in terms of the broader political structure, no, I don't think that's something we would want to adopt. I mean, the reality is that we all know that we have an infrastructure problem in this country. I mean, a recent poll found that only 29% of people in New Zealand feel like we have adequate infrastructure. That means the majority know that we have significant shortfalls. And the way around this is through our political system. In fact, there's a report that will come out next week from Helen Clark Foundation and WSP that really looks into the funding gap and how we get past the lack of funding which comes from the political side of things. And what we need to do is mature as a country and take this infrastructure outside of the political system. People know we don't have enough infrastructure, we don't spend enough money on it, and people are generally willing to contribute towards improvement in that infrastructure. So people will pay higher taxes if they know that that means that their property, that their commute, that their lifestyle will be safeguarded from the changes in the climate and extreme
if they can
weather.
afford it.
And if they can afford it, yeah. But in the long term, better infrastructure makes cities more affordable because we have cheaper ways to get around the city. We have to pay less for insurance. There's all kinds of benefits to spending money now. And study after study shows that every dollar we spend now in infrastructure will be returned to us
But of course,
multiple-fold.
your advocacy is around infrastructure that is not the same old infrastructure of what we've done before, because that's part of the problem you've said.
That's right. We shouldn't be looking at like-for-like replacement when we build infrastructure. We should be improving and building, and even though it is a pretty loose term, sustainable infrastructure.
Regenerative, I heard.
Yeah, regenerative. I mean, there's all kinds of terms that are floated around, but reality is concrete and steel is just not the way forward. And so there are a multitude of ways to build up a cities to be more resilient and that won't require as much maintenance and as much funding down the road. But again, we have to get past that obstacle of the political system being the main way that we plan the future. We can't work on a 3-year political cycle for a 30, 40-year problem. The reality is climate change, extreme weather is intractable as a problem for the individual, but as a community, as a nation, we can address the problems. We just have to do it.
Manfredo, you've been very quiet. What would you add to this?
Well, here we need to probably look at it in a different perspective if we want to make any change. The first one probably has to do with this question of the political system. And the question of the political system in reality is to be addressed by making a very clear distinction between what is politics and what is the political. In other words, what is happening is that we have a sort of delegation system that goes ahead, by which we kind of pretend to be active in that space, but substantially we are totally detached and disconnected. We are happy to complain. We are happy to look at what people think about things. But the problem is that in many cases people don't have the means, they don't have the capacity to elaborate complex solutions, elaborate complex problems. So the question of infrastructure is a typical one. And we see what is happening on an everyday basis, because what we look at our system is simply not functional. I remember when I came to New Zealand about 15 years ago, and there was at that time an article presenting research by Victoria University around the usage of urban amenities in Wellington. They were looking at the youth, and in particular people between 18 and 25. And they found out that people living in the Hutt Valley were actually, the number of people living in the Hutt Valley who would use the facilities of the central city in Wellington was extremely low. And that was quite surprising to me, because I'm from Milan. And for me, there was not a point of thinking you live in one part of Milan or another one, you never use the city. For me, the city was just our playground, the place where we used to be every day. And the city wouldn't have any sort of zoning or spontaneous zoning of daily practices. So that's a major problem, because when we look at how this system we put in place, and infrastructural questions, as we said before, expands to cultural infrastructure, social infrastructure, that are actually based on this kind of urban infrastructure that Tim was talking about, that when gets disrupted through different things, the one I was mentioning before, the question of, for instance, the technological change that we have in all sectors, in all these sectors, then of course they have an impact which is dramatic. And we need to go back to re-establish our rights of our entitlements of being citizens. And that goes exactly in this dimension between, this distinction between political and politics. So we have to be human, so being politics, in the sense of being part of the city, the polis, for politics come from there. So that's the way in which we probably should start working on these things. I'm doing research with my guys on very specific forms of, if you want to say, counter-planning or resistance that are happening in various parts of the world. Particularly, I'm looking at informal settlements in China and other places, in which you see incredible models that are really models of differential development we have to absolutely treasure and learn from.
So what do we have to learn from these particular communities? Give us an example.
Well, there's a fancy one, so to say, which is one lovely case happening in the most well-known city of southern China, which is Canton, Guangzhou. This city is a city that has had an incredible urban development over the last 40 years, starting with the big development after 78, when China decided to, in a way, modify the previous political orientation towards market, and with the open door policy opened up to a completely different system of socialist market, whatever it is, economy. What has happened is that the old system that would allow some particular groups that were located in particular settlements, so villages, rural villages, allowed them to have a very peculiar set of rights of land use, which was essentially a perpetual usufruct, but connected to their residency. So it was not ownership, was like an ownership, but connected to the fact that they were living there. They were part of a community. Actually, a community was a collective. Now, this thing, when the cities expanded, has created an incredible complexity and contradiction, because you had the city in which land is totally owned by the state, and those villages that had, yes, the land in this sort of common property, but with a particular capacity of management by the collective of the so-called villagers, one or more collectives. So what has happened is that you have this conflict between the two different kind of governance in cities, in most of the cases in central cities. In the case of Canton, that's the village of which this student of mine is working, a PhD candidate, she's there right now, is working on, is a village which is probably a kilometer away from the new central city of Guangzhou. the central city was, the center of the city was shifted. So there was a new beautiful center with open spaces, museums, opera houses, these kind of things. And this village is a village that resisted to the forces that, on one hand, from the market, were actually trying to get into this place because the land value is extremely high given the position, the location, and were trying to enter in that particular space of the communities to transform the condition and particularly take advantage of the location. On the other hand, the state, which was essentially interested in reorganizing these spaces which were essentially organized according to the old principle of the collective space of the communes. And that was, of course, very dysfunctional because you can imagine a portion of the city grown incrementally in a sort of organic way against the other one, which is heavily planned with major infrastructure. So how that ended up being. So this conflict was a conflict which is still ongoing, and is a conflict that has generated an incredible capacity, as I was saying before, of a differential development. What is happening there? In half square kilometer, you can find something like 20,000 entrepreneurs that work in the food delivery industry. And 20,000 of these 20,000, there are probably 1,000 or 1,500 that have their own individual premises to prepare food. So it's a sort of diffused kitchen with hundreds of scooterists delivering food to outside. Now, there's not a single global corporation that has been able to enter there. So what is interesting here? It is interesting that exactly the heritage and the lineage of the so-called Asiatic system and of the post-revolutionary system or the revolutionary system that essentially transformed completely the system that they had in the past in terms of redistribution of property, collectivization, and so on. And that lineage is what has, at this point in time, been able to resist to those incredible transformation with eviction, etc., exploitation, and so on, and create. I'm not romanticizing it, right? So the living conditions of these people is not that great. But what I'm saying is that what we see there is that inside the system, you see counter models that are incredibly valuable.
So there was something you said even before the Chinese example. You're talking about Milan and how it has this central kind of home, kind of common area. But so many cities don't have that. Is that organically developed or?
Milan is a city which is a complicated one. It's a very complicated one. And yes, we have a sort of culture cultural practices that belong to a particular form of cities built around communities and built around strong systems based on cohesion and benevolence, in many cases of people who were ruling the city over the centuries. Of course, this has changed a lot because it's probably one of the most important economic centers in Italy and in a sense also in Europe, and that has transformed radically the spaces of the city. And in most of the cases, we see that, unfortunately, not all what appears at first glimpse great to tourists, walking from the dome to the castle, which is the Via Dante, so where you get the beautiful how can I say, scenery of a city in which is the best Starbucks ever. You have to notice that Starbucks is actually a Milanese cafe transplanted from a guy in Seattle all over the world that makes us possible to have an espresso even here in Auckland. That's the merit of Starbucks. The not so great merit is actually the fact that it has completely disrupted those elements, what has been dubbed as Starbuckization or McDonaldization by the sociology.
With the whole globalization thing, right. So I'm just wondering now, how do we bring all this together? You know, you've got the social political, you've got the infrastructural, you've got the architectural, the energy.
We fight a lot.
Yeah. I mean, do you have sort of a direction for what you think you might be able to do with your research? I'll tell you one thing that you and I spoke about, Paola, that you could maybe integrate into this is we talked about the areas of some cities, including here, every city has it, where it's, urban, but it's all industrial. And so devoid of nature, built of all these structural elements that are impervious and not so good in climate change, don't have a community element, etc. Maybe that would be kind of an example like what might be a visionary thing to do in cities, because all cities have these, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and many cities have grown around these industrial areas that once used to be outside, the city centers. But as the cities grow, all these areas become part of the city itself and the built environment, and the infrastructure grows around them. So in many cases, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. What was born before, what was there before, and then integrated, But nonetheless, they are complex systems because, again, their main driver is economic. They are productive areas, and they are the productive fabric of New Zealand, and in the same way of many nations. Sometimes, and very often, it's very difficult to penetrate that mindset of everything is driven by economy and this is highly productive, and what matters is only the dollar, the money that you make out of the activity that you conduct in these areas. But this approach has led to what we have today. I mean, look at the East Tamaki area. That was one of the most impacted areas from Cyclone Gabrielle. And the industrial side of that was really strongly impacted, with buildings that, again, had to stop producing their goods, and therefore their economy was highly impacted. What is important to say in these areas is also that we have a huge amount of people who work there on a daily basis. And the conditions we put these people into when they work in the buildings, in the industrial buildings, who are basically tin cans, right? They are built out of very cheap, usually, technologies, very basic technologies that don't look at the energy efficiency most of the time. They don't look at the indoor environmental quality, so the thermal comfort, the air the people breathe inside, and, all the conditions, all those workers are on at least 8 hours a day, right? That is part of the problem. So if we start doing and retrofitting, for instance, these buildings and building the new industrial buildings in a different way, that is looking much more at this integrated perspective of energy efficiency, indoor environmental quality, the materials we use, the morphology we have, how we integrate, for instance, nature, and we maintain the permeability of the area through green roofs, through, permeable surfaces around them, we can start changing this path. It's been demonstrated that these industrial areas have also a huge impact on our flora and fauna as well. Quite interestingly, an increase of bird strikes around these areas and around the cities due to the higher level of light that is, let's say, present in these areas on a 24/7 basis, right? It disrupts the circadian rhythm of the birds, of the natural species, and also it increases the bird strikes. To some extent, it's been demonstrated that it also changes the pattern of, reproduction. So there's a huge impact, if you like, on native species and how we protect those. So when we start working in a much more integrated way, also for these industrial zones, for instance, the benefits are for many. So for the workers, which in turn, increases the productivity, if you like, of these people and can have a positive impact on the economy of these businesses. But it also improves the condition of the natural ecosystem and how we can integrate the natural ecosystem. And around it, if we start increasing the amenities, Manfredo talked about amenities earlier, in these areas, it means that all the people who live in the surrounding of these areas, which are usually vulnerable communities, communities that experience hardship, energy hardship in many cases as well, social difficulties and social challenges, will have a much better environment at hand, that they can use. Industrial zones are pretty much single-use zone. You can't find much more than, those industrial buildings, a little, one or two cafes every now and then for the people who work there, and that's it.
And the cafe is not great.
And the cafe is not great, you're right.
They don't have espresso.
And they don't have that. They don't have the good one. But anyway, this is the positive change that we can drive on those. And they ultimately, again, become more regenerative for the environment, for the economy, and for the communities.
So we're just about out of time. Does anybody have a burning conclusion?
No, but I would say, in terms of how do we start to solve this multitude of problems. That's the benefit of an academic research center like Future Cities. We're not beholden to a specific political party. We're not reliant on a single source of funding. And we have the ability to draw on a huge breadth of expertise across the university, try to collaborate with as many people as possible. We have the credibility to work with public agencies, with industry, and bring together those interdisciplinary teams in order to address problems and look at them in angles that we might not just see as we silo ourselves into our own expert domains, right? So the idea of an academic research center is really one of the places where we can incubate some of these ideas and start to address them, again, outside of the political system, outside of the funding structures that often limit our ability to think of new ideas.
Well, and importantly, transnationally.
Yes.
Because you can see from our faces.
Yeah.
Not necessarily
Actually, I think that's right. I think transnationally is really important, right? To draw from and give to beyond our shores.
Another important point, I think, for
Paola?
us is, again, as Tim said, to get out of our ivory tower of academia and get our hands dirty and work with industry and work with stakeholders and take advantage of data and evidence that comes out of our research and be able to translate that into something that can inform, I'm not saying influence, inform, decision making, inform political decisions, and hopefully in a better way. So better informed political decisions, because everything that we try to do is data driven and is evidence based.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, for coming and joining us on Sustain.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.